thoughtful. In every age, value is more than numbers. It is a mirror of the human soul. In the winter of 1847, a storm gathered over Europe, not of thunder, but of words. In a dimly lit room in Brussels, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels bent over a stack of papers, their breath fogging the glass. They were writing a text that would outlive them both. Its opening line would echo across a century. A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. The line was not a prophecy. It was an accusation. Across the continent, revolutions were stirring. In France, workers demanded bread and the right to speak. In Vienna, students filled the streets. In Berlin, soldiers faced crowds with shaking hands. The old order trembled. Marx believed that the age of kings and clergy was ending and that history itself was stepping into the factory. The Communist Manifesto was only 30 pages, yet it carried the weight of a new religion. Its style was urgent, poetic, militant. It declared that the world was divided into two great camps, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The first owned the means of production, the second sold its labor to survive. Between them lay an unspoken war. The history of all hitherto existing society, Marx wrote, is the history of class struggles. The manifesto was not born in peace. It was a child of hunger and censorship, of exiles who wrote by candlelight. Marx himself was already under police watch. His wife Jenny pawned their silverware to buy paper. Engels sent what money he could from Manchester, where the smoke from the mills turned noon into dusk. They were writing not from comfort but conviction. The pamphlets spread like wildfire, smuggled, copied, whispered, burned. To the rulers of Europe it was a contagion, to the workers a revelation. It gave their suffering a script, their silence a name. They were not merely poor, they were a class, bound by circumstance and divided by wealth. The manifesto turned pain into identity. Yet Marx did not preach despair. He believed that capitalism itself was digging its own grave. Its brilliance, the drive to expand, to innovate, to globalize, would also be its undoing. For every invention that increased productivity would sharpen the contradictions between labor and capital. As wealth concentrated, discontent would spread. The very engine of progress would ignite revolt. But 1848 proved that history does not move on cue. The revolutions that swept Europe that year were glorious and doomed. In Paris, barricades rose and fell within weeks. In Vienna, reformers fled. In Berlin, hopes drowned in smoke and blood. Monarchs who trembled in spring ruled again by autumn. The dream collapsed, leaving only exile and ink. For Marx, it was a brutal awakening. The people were not yet ready. The old world was stubborn, and the new one, fragile. The same workers who marched for justice also feared chaos. The same students who demanded freedom feared the loss of order. The revolution failed not only by force, but by hesitation. The tradition of all dead generations, Marx wrote afterward, weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. He meant that every society carries ghosts of habit, of obedience, of inherited fear. The oppressed often borrow the language of their oppressors to describe their hopes. Even rebellion wears the costume of the past. Exiled again, first to Paris, then to London, Marx watched as Europe rebuilt its barricades with commerce instead of cobblestones. The bourgeoisie, he said, had learned a lesson. Give the people a taste of comfort, and they will forget the taste of freedom. The factory owner and the banker had replaced the aristocrat, but the hierarchy remained. The names changed, the dependents did not. He wrote not in bitterness, but in clarity. Revolution, he realized, is not a single moment, it is a process of consciousness. The battle is not fought only in streets, but in minds. Until people see the system that shapes their desires, they cannot change it. He called this awakening class consciousness, the point when workers recognize themselves not as individuals competing, but as participants in a shared story. The philosophers have only interpreted the world, he had written. The point, however, is to change it. But changing the world, he now saw, required more than courage. It required organization, patience, and a morality strong enough to resist both greed and vengeance. Revolution without ethics, he feared, would replace one tyranny with another. And indeed, history would prove him right and wrong again. His ideas would inspire movements that freed millions, and regimes that enslaved them. But in 1848, all that was still ahead. In his small London apartment, surrounded by debt and illness, Marx remained defiant. He wrote not as a prophet, but as a witness. "The old world is dying," he said, "and the new struggles to be born." His faith was not in violence, but in inevitability. He believed that economic laws would drive social transformation as surely as gravity shapes motion. He imagined history as a great engine, one powered by conflict, moving toward a future of equality. But engines, like revolutions, have engineers, and he underestimated how imperfect they would be. The revolutions of 1848 ended with kings restored and constitutions torn. Marx's writings were banned, his friends scattered. Yet ideas, once spoken, cannot be recalled. The spectre he named would haunt palaces and parliaments for generations. The fear of the workers' uprising shaped the politics of Europe long after the barricades were gone. In exile, Marx's own family paid the price of his conviction. Hunger, eviction, disease, 3 of his children died before adulthood. He buried them in cheap graves and kept writing. To stop would have been to surrender twice, once to poverty and once to doubt. Engels called him the most hated and calumniated man of his time. But he also called him something rarer, the greatest living thinker. For while others built fortunes, Marx built frameworks. He had turned history into a science of power and conscience. Even as his revolutions failed, his influence grew. Students in Russia, Italy, and Germany copied his works by hand. Workers gathered in secret to read his pamphlets aloud. The church called him heretic. Governments called him dangerous. He smiled at both. "If they fear words," he said, "then words still have power." The manifesto ends with a challenge. "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." It was both a battle cry and a benediction. Not a call to hatred, but to solidarity, to the belief that humanity, divided by class, could one day recognize itself again as a whole. That dream would travel further than Marx ever could, across languages, borders, and centuries. It would ignite revolutions, inspire philosophers, and terrify kings. It would be misunderstood, abused, idolized, and forbidden. But beneath all the noise, its core remained simple, a plea for dignity in a world of exchange. Perhaps that is why the manifesto still stirs the air when read aloud, because it speaks to the most ancient of hungers, not for wealth, but for meaning. It asks whether freedom can exist while necessity is unequally shared. It dares to suggest that justice might be measured not by charity, but by structure. This is Masters of Value, the echo of ideas that built our world. Next time, we follow the exiled philosopher into his longest labor, Capital and the Paradox of Progress, the anatomy of a system that creates and destroys in the same breath, and the question that haunted him to his final page: can a world driven by profit ever honor the value of a soul?